But now, millennial temple, beginning in Ezekiel chapter 43, the first question that I would have for you on that is, why do you suppose that there would even be temple worship on this side of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ?
Because it was predicted.
It's what?
It was not predicted. It was prophesied.
Because the Jews didn't accept Jesus and they still believe they're under their original covenant.
Well, but that won't be true going into the millennium.
They don't.
I mean, yes, there will be temple worship during the tribulation.
Oh, I thought that's what you're talking about.
No.
Oh, you're talking about after?
The question is, this is the millennial temple that will exist not only, yes, the Jews will build it either just before or early, one or the other. We don't really know the timeline of that because the Bible doesn't tell us. It'll either be just before or early in the tribulation, that temple will be built.
Just before Daniel.
Yeah, but,
It's a place
For the
Yes.
millennial.
okay, the place for him to reside, but as we get into this description, you're going to find that it's not just going to see Jesus and let's worship him. The sacrificial system is going to be reintroduced. And we will see right here in Ezekiel that not only is it Ezekiel's description, but it is a requirement from God himself that sacrifices be made. So the question is, why would Christ require a sacrifice to be made? Not during the tribulation, mind you, but after the second coming as we go into the millennium.
It's a memorial to a sacrifice.
Okay,
It's a remembrance?
it's well, Bruce gave us pretty much the best descriptive of that, a memorial sacrifice. Because the Jews at this point, I think, need to be reminded that yes, they did have a sacrificial system. That's what it was given to us for, but that sacrifice has been made. And so every time they come into the presence of God to offer a sacrifice at that point, it's not a looking forward to the Messiah that will come, but a reminder to them to look backward on what they missed.
Are you talking about the Feast of Tabernacles? Booths?
Well, that will happen once a year.
Yeah.
But we're not even talking just that. That will occur.
Okay.
But we're talking, as we get into this, we'll see that this is going to be an ongoing, every week affair.
I would think that in some ways to say that the Jews are now going to understand that Christ was the Messiah, and then to go backwards to the old method that their ancestors used, to me almost sounds counterintuitive.
Yes, I agree.
It just
True.
seems,
It would
Backwards.
seem that.
well, I'm like I know anything, so
Really?
yeah.
Look at it also from this perspective. There will be Christians, those that will accept Christ during the tribulation period, who survive the tribulation, although they will probably be few in number. They will live on into the tribulation to help repopulate the earth during that period. There may very well be, based upon the last passage in Revelation that we studied before we kind of came back to Ezekiel, that would indicate that even those who are not saved, but who did not accept the mark of the beast, and who managed to survive the tribulation, will be allowed to live on, although they will be under the rule of Christ, whether they like it or not. Now, I'm not saying that's,
That won't like it.
no. You're
I
getting ahead of yourself.
Yeah, that would be. Yeah, maybe.
No, what I was about to say there is that we cannot be dogmatic about that, but that last passage in Revelation chapter 19 that we looked at certainly would indicate that that is a distinct possibility, but again, we can't be dogmatic about it. Then the third group that we know will live on past the second coming and into the millennial kingdom is, of course, what?
The remnant.
Say that louder.
The remnant.
Of what?
Israel.
Israel. we're going to have the Jewish nation reinstituted, reinvigorated, and live on. So at this point, there is a high possibility that the majority of the world's population may in fact at that point be, guess what? Jewish people. And you're going to be looking at Jews as they reproduce and do what God tells them they need to do. Well, you're going to have a whole lot of Jewish people as well as some Gentiles that are going to be born during the millennial kingdom. And part of that, what's that?
I was going to say with free will.
Yeah, with free will, but they also need to be taught, because what is the biggest thing right now when it comes to from one generation to the next that both the Jews and now the church has made the mistake of?
Not teaching their children.
There you go. The big failure of the Jewish people, and now we the church are doing the same thing, is failing to teach the next generation. So I believe that, along with what Bruce just mentioned as far as this being a memorial sacrifice, that one of the best ways that they can be taught what Christ did is for them to see and live with the requirements of the... They're not living under the law because Christ has fulfilled the law, but they're living by the requirements of the law as it applies to temple worship, that they can see what Christ has done, because you're going to have an entirely new generation, in fact multiple generations that will rise up during the millennial kingdom that need to learn this. And in fact we will see that there will be some who don't learn that message. And the reason we know that is because one of the last things we'll see in the book of Revelation when we go back to that is at the end of the millennial kingdom, as soon as Satan is released from his prison, what's the first thing that he does?
Raise an army.
Raises an army to rebel. Well, you can't have an army unless you've got people who are willing to join it. So we can see that there will be those who live on and are born in the millennial kingdom who don't accept Christ.
Will any of it be for atonement at all?
What's that?
Now that Jesus is here, will any of these sacrifices be for atonement?
No, that's already been done.
Yeah.
No,
he's here.
what Bruce said earlier, that covers the whole thing. It is a memorial to remember and to teach. But no, there is no reason for an atonement at all, because that's already been done.
I guess from our perspective, knowing how the old system was and why it was no longer necessary, it doesn't make sense to have to go back to it. But I get it that, anyway, Jesus knows what he's doing.
I'll add one point to that here in just a minute, Bruce.
Okay, good.
I was just gonna, I think maybe one of the other things is the millennial period is for the Jews. I mean, largely because it's to fulfill those promises that God made to them that haven't been fulfilled yet. And one of the things they were supposed to be was a light to the world. And they never really achieved that. Now, Jerusalem is going to be the center of the world.
Quite literally, actually.
Quite literally, it'll be the center of the world, and I think these sacrifices are just kind of what they should have done and what the way it should have been.
I would agree with that.
You know?
There's one other point before we actually get into chapter 43 here I want to make as a comment to what Connie just mentioned. How many of you have been in a butcher shop where they're actively slaughtering animals?
No, thank you.
What did it smell like?
I don't remember, I was a child, but
There's a place in LA that has several rendering shops, and you don't want to spend much time there. You drive through, you know where you're at.
Keep that thought in mind.
Well, has anybody ever gone through a town where they're cooking chitlins? That's what, I know it's not the same thing, but it's...
There's bad and there's bad.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the things that a lot of the Jewish rabbis, have written about, that of writings that still exist, is that when temple sacrifice was still ongoing, of course, prior to Christ, is that it was a nasty, bloody, smelly affair. That when you went into the area of the temple where the sacrifices were actually being slaughtered, it was dirty. And I don't mean dirty as in unsanitary, as much as there's blood dripping everywhere. You've got entrails that are now exposed to the air. And folks, if you've ever been around an animal that's just recently been gutted or what have you, you need a mask on. It's nasty. Well, why then, of course, you might ask, do you want to do that? People need to understand because, and in fact, as I asked that earlier, Brenda and Larry, only one that even mentioned that they had been around one. I've been through close to one enough to at least get a whiff of it one time, and that was plenty. Most people today don't really know what that's about. And of course, no Jew has seen a sacrifice in the temple for 2,000 years. People need to understand what Jesus did. When he shed his blood, it was not some nice, neat little, just like now whenever the state executes somebody, they want to make it a nice, neat, civil affair that, the state wants to convince people, oh, they just went to sleep. They didn't feel any pain. That's not what way a sacrifice, certainly that's not what happened with the crucifixion. It was a bloody, painful, filthy, it was a repulsive affair. And I think the world needs to know that is what Jesus did. And that being exposed to the sacrifice and that sacrificial system, I think is a very visual as well as, it's a word I'm looking for.
Visceral.
Nauseated.
Yeah,
Visceral.
the smelly affair that folks need to realize that that's what our God did for us to pay for this. But anyway,
This is what it takes to pay for your sin?
This is what it takes to pay for your sins. Absolutely.
Something died so we can live.
All right, chapter 43. And again, as I said, we're not covering every single part of this because that's 6 chapters, and we're not going to spend that much time on it. I'm going to catch the parts that are important. Chapter 43, the first 9 verses. It says, "Then he led me to the gate facing toward the east." Now notice, it's definitely talking about the eastern gate of the temple. By this point in Ezekiel, the temple has already been rebuilt. So we're talking about an active temple at this point. "And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was coming from the way of the east. And his voice was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And it was like the appearance of the vision which I saw, like the vision which I saw when he came to destroy the city. And the visions were like the visions when I saw by the river Kibar, and I fell on my face, and the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate facing toward the east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. Then I heard one man speaking to me from the house, while a man was standing beside me. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell among the sons of Israel forever. And the house of Israel will not again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their harlotry, and by the corpses of their kings when they die, by setting their threshold by my threshold, and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only the wall between me and them. And they have defiled my holy name by their abominations which they have committed. So I've consumed them in my anger. Now let them put away their harlotry and the corpses of their kings far from me, and I will dwell among them forever." This is a description of Christ's triumphal entry. Right after the Battle of Armageddon, then the second coming of Christ, whenever he deals with business and destroys those that are attacking Israel and Jerusalem, well, among those, of course, are going to be the disobedient Jews and all of these other armies and leaders. Of course, they call them kings here, but of whatever kind of, political leader is going to be put down during the second coming. So at this point, now that that has been done, Jesus is now beginning his millennial reign. The first thing that he does here is make his triumphal entry. Now, the last time he made a triumphal entry, of course, he came in riding a donkey and came into Jerusalem. Here, it doesn't say that he was riding anything, but of course we know that he comes back in the second coming riding a horse, and at this point, he enters into the temple itself, coming by the eastern gate. Any of you aware of the fact that even when there still was a temple before the Romans destroyed it in the year 70, the eastern gate had been permanently locked?
Yes, I saw it.
It was. They locked the eastern gate, and at this point, if you go back and read the description of the reconstruction of this temple, it will tell, Ezekiel tells us that there are several gates into the temple complex, but they are specifically told to lock the eastern gate because there's only one person allowed to come in by the eastern gate. And that's when Jesus comes in his triumphal entry.
My study notes say that shortly before the earlier temple was destroyed, God's glory left the temple and the city and went east. So appropriately, it returned from the east.
Well, what did the angels tell the church when Jesus ascended?
You will see him come.
First
in a like manner.
first part of the book of Acts.
You will see him come in a like manner.
Yeah, as you saw him leave, you'll see him come back.
Okay.
Now, wasn't that, that was what Merrill's talking about. That occurred before the Babylonians destroyed the temple, wasn't it? And that God, wasn't Ezekiel saying that he saw God basically leave the temple by the eastern gate?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.
He left and didn't go back. But here we see that he will indeed come back. And although this just describes him coming in his glory, the Jews, and it's interesting that this word actually isn't found in the Hebrew Old Testament, but the Jews actually have a word which we've borrowed from that in the English language to describe the glory of God. Does anybody remember what that is?
Shekinah?
The Shekinah glory. There you go. And that's what this is describing, is his Shekinah glory. Flip over, if you will, back a couple books to Isaiah chapter 30. Well, when Jesus comes in, of course, it says his glory fills the temple. And in Isaiah 30, verse 29, says, "You will have songs as in the night when you keep the festival, and gladness of heart as when one marches to the sound of the flute, to go to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. And the Lord will cause his voice of authority to be heard, and the descending of his arm to be seen in fierce anger, and a flame of a consuming fire, and cloudbursts, downpour, and hailstorms." We'll stop that part there, but I'll then flip over to Isaiah chapter 43. In 43:2 it says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they will not overflow you. when you walk through the fire, you will not be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. Now, in this passage we read here in Ezekiel, after Christ comes in his Shekinah glory, then the message that is given to the Jews is that all of your sins, all of the rebellion that you've done, all that you have done to bring discredit to my name has been done away with. It has been burned up. And notice these two passages in Isaiah talks about exactly that concept, that the burning fire of the Lord is going to annihilate his enemies. But then in Isaiah 42 there, it says, except you, Israel, will be, delivered from that, essentially. I'm paraphrasing here. So what Jesus is saying, or what God is saying to them in Ezekiel chapter 43, that as his glory of the Lord enters the temple, it's not only a time for celebration, but he's reminding the Jews that all of these times that you have rebelled, that stuff has been burned up. My anger has been poured out, but now, never again. That is the aftermath of Jesus' second coming and the Battle of Armageddon. Chapter 44, first 4 verses.
What is it?
Are you in Isaiah?
Yeah, no, back to Ezekiel.
Ezekiel, okay.
Ezekiel chapter 44, verses 1 through 4 says, Then he brought me back by the way of the outer gate of the sanctuary, which faces the east, and it was shut. Well, why is it shut? Because Jesus has already entered in, and he's the only one allowed to go in. And the Lord said to me, This gate shall be shut, it shall not be opened, and no one shall enter by it, for the Lord God of Israel has entered by it, therefore it shall be shut. As for the prince, he shall sit in it as prince to eat bread before the Lord. He shall enter by way of the porch of the gate, and shall go out by the same way. Then he brought me by way of the north gate to the front of the house, and I looked, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord, and I fell on my face. So clearly, Jesus is already in the temple, and now he's given instructions to shut the eastern gate because nobody else goes in by that. But he does say that the prince will approach the temple, have fellowship there at the gate, but then turn and have to leave. Now there's some question as to who the prince is. Some commentators that I've read believe this could be the resurrected King David. Now why would King David not be referred to as the king? Why would he be the prince if that's who this is talking about?
Jesus is the king.
Jesus is absolutely. There is now only one king, and it's Jesus. So a lot of people believe that this will either be the resurrected King David or a descendant of King David who has now been identified as the regent, who is now recognized as the prince. Whether or not King David still has any living descendants, we can only speculate. But while we may have to speculate, I'm pretty sure God has already got that under control. But a lot of people think this will either be a descendant of King David who will be living during that time, or it will be David himself. But even he is not allowed to actually enter the gate.
Pastor, can I ask a quick question? What gate, when Jesus was here the first time, did he use at the temple? When he had...
Actually, that's the problem, is the Gospels never tell us.
Right.
I doubt he went in by the eastern gate because the Jews, the rabbis, would have had that gate shut.
Right.
And in order for him to have entered, not that he couldn't have entered the eastern gate,
That's what I'm asking.
but he would have had to have revealed himself clearly as the Messiah, and the only way that gate could have been opened at that point would be for him to have done it supernaturally. Because even his followers at that point would not have had the ability or the might to force, to overcome the temple guards to force that gate open. The other reason I would say that Jesus would not have pushed the issue to have entered that gate is because at that point, while his disciples knew that he was indeed God and King, the rest of Israel, and certainly not the authorities in the temple, did not recognize him as such. And as Jesus stressed to his own disciples, who, like Peter, who wanted to take up a sword to protect him, he reminded them, like, put your sword back in its sheath. This is what I came here for. I didn't come to be king yet. Right?
I heard that, this sounds silly now, but the Muslims locked the gate, Eastern Gate, because they didn't want Jesus to come through.
Well, that would not wouldn't be the case, because that part of the temple got destroyed in the year 70. The only thing of the temple that is even still in existence would be the outer retaining wall. That's the far outside wall all the way around the temple complex. The temple itself, which would have included that eastern gate, that got destroyed in the year 70. Been long gone.
Because I saw a picture of it on television, and they said that they told that story about the gate. There was a door there, and Muslims locked it off. Must have been that wall.
It could have been part of that wall, but that would, what's that?
I don't know where it was from, but they showed a wall, it was all blocked up.
And it's entirely possible that could be on the eastern side of the outer retaining wall,
Yeah.
but all I'm saying is that would not have been part of the temple itself.
They couldn't stop them anyway.
Yeah.
Silly.
Is that the Wailing Wall you're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, what Jews today call the Wailing Wall, that's all that's left of it, and that's not even considered the temple itself. That's the outer retaining wall. All right. But anyway, now I'm just going to catch a few highlights of this. If you look in verse 15, there in chapter 44, you notice it says the Levitical priest, the sons of Zadok. And notice here right off the bat, what that tells us is that while a lot of Jews today don't really know what their heritage is because it's been 2,000 years and a lot of records have been lost, either those records are going to be recovered or they will be miraculously provided because, well, we know the one person who does know who's qualified and not qualified is, of course, God. But it clearly states here that Zadok, now anybody remember who Zadok is? Zadok was the high priest during the reign of King David. And following his time as high priest, King David had made a declaration that from that point on, all of the high priests wouldn't just be sons of Aaron, but they would be descendants of Zadok. And so we see that brought up again here. It said, the Levitical priests, the sons of Zadok, who kept charge of my sanctuary when the sons of Israel went astray from me, shall come near to me to minister to me, and they shall stand before me to offer me the fat and the blood, declares the Lord God. Well, it says, offering the fat and the blood, what is that a description of?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice. So the Levitical priesthood is going to be active again. They're going to be giving sacrifices. Verse 16 says, they shall enter my sanctuary. They shall come near to my table to minister to me and keep my charge. And it shall be that when they enter at the gates of the inner court, they shall be clothed with linen garments, and wool shall not be on them while they are ministering in the gates of the inner court and in the house. Linen turbans shall be on their heads, and linen undergarments shall be on their loins. They shall not gird them with anything that makes them sweat. All right, now, why linen and why not wool?
Wool makes you sweat.
Well, wool does make you sweat, but what about wintertime? It does get a little cold there in Israel. At least it does now. We don't know what the climate might be during this particular time. But why not? There's another reason behind why not wool.
God
Wool comes from lambs.
Okay, say, what's that?
Did God fashion those garments for Adam and Eve or fur?
No, but say that louder, Merrill.
Wool comes from lambs.
There you go. Wool comes from the animals that are going to be sacrificed. And they are to separate themselves from that. That's the part of the sacrificial animal. And they're not being allowed to wear that. They have to come in with something that has no animal skin to it at all. Because what's linen made from?
Flax.
Flax. Absolutely. It's no animal type of at all that's to be on their bodies. But the point here is this clearly tells us the sacrificial system has been reinstituted. It's not just during the tribulation, but here God is requiring it during the millennial kingdom, after he comes back. And we know that this is indeed following the second coming, because when else would the glory of the Lord come through the eastern gate and fill the temple? That in itself, that passage proves to us that this whole passage of Scripture is a description of what's going on after the second coming. And they have in fact begun the temple sacrifices again. All right, go over, if you will, to chapter 47. Now, one of the things that we have been discussing is this reference to the Eastern Sea. Because as I mentioned, when Jesus stands on the Mount of Olives and the Mount of Olives splits, it says there'll be a river then that will start flowing. Half of it going toward the Western Sea, which is a Mediterranean, half to the Eastern Sea. The Dead Sea isn't east of Jerusalem. It's southeast. It is at a far easterly longitude, but it's a good bit south of Jerusalem. There is no sea east of Jerusalem. It's all downhill until you get to the Jordan River, and everything past that's just out in the desert. This gives us the idea of how that might be accomplished. Chapter 47, these first 12 verses. Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, for the house faced east. And the water was flowing down from under, from the right side of the house, from south of the altar. By the way, why is he consistently referring to this temple as a house?
The house of the Lord.
There you go, because it's God's house now. Because the glory of the Lord has filled it once again. Yes, sir.
Our Bible says temple.
Yes.
Well, and that's an accurate translation, but the Hebrew actually refers to it as a house, because it is the house of the Lord. He brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gate by way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side. When the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits. By the way, does everybody remember how much a cubit is?
18 inches.
Yeah, well, technically.
Approximately.
Yeah, from the tip of your finger to your elbow, that's a cubit.
Well, your cubit and my cubit wouldn't be the same.
No, that's why they quit using that years ago. But that was a cubit. Well, actually, during that time, what was the official cubit measurement? Does anybody know? Yeah, it's whatever that they would met. Whenever a king assumed the throne, they'd measure his arm, and he was the standard of what the cubit was. The problem is, when the king died and he was replaced by his son was not the same size. Cubit would change. All right, again, this verse 4. Again, he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the knees. Again he measured 1,000, led me through the water reaching the loins. And he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not ford, for the water had risen enough water to swim in, a river that could not be forded. So the farther east he goes, and keep in mind, now, don't think Jerusalem today. Remember, at this point in history, God has changed the geography. He said all the mountains have fled away. The land has leveled out, with the exception of Jerusalem. What happened to Jerusalem?
Raised up on a mountain.
Jerusalem is now the only place that is raised up on a mountain. So everywhere you go from Jerusalem, you're going downhill. And notice that the farther he goes, and 1,000 cubits, of course you're looking at probably about 1,500, 1,600 feet, something like that. So maybe, what, third of a mile? Every third of a mile or so, this river flowing from the throne keeps getting deeper and deeper as it's going downhill, until finally it's up to the point that it's so deep that you can't walk through it. You got to swim it. He said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were many trees on the one side and on the other. Then he said to me, these waters go out toward the eastern region and go down into the Arabah. Now the Arabah is the name for the Israeli desert down where the Dead Sea is. Then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh. So apparently what God is going to do is that river is going to flow eastward and then at some point turn and go southward into the Dead Sea. Well, if it flows eastward and then turns southward, what does that tell us more than likely this is going on here? What flows southward through that area of of Israel now? The Jordan River. So if the Jordan River is still there, apparently this flows eastward into the Jordan and then turns and goes with the Jordan down into the Dead Sea. But now notice what happens. Here's the miracle of all this. Mm-hmm. I don't think any of us, am I correct in assuming that none of us in here have actually been to the Dead Sea?
I have.
Okay, tell us about it.
It's very dead.
It's dead?
Well, you can't go swimming, but don't swallow the water.
Don't they call it the salt sea?
Salt water, yeah. There's no fish into it or anything.
And why not?
Because it's all salt.
Yeah, it is so salty. Yeah, nothing lives in there. That's why it is in fact called the Dead Sea, because it is so salty, nothing can live in it.
You can
One of the
swim
lowest
it.
elevations on the earth.
It is the lowest point on the surface of the earth. Everything flows in there. There's no way for the water to flow out. The only way the water gets out of there, and the reason the Dead Sea does not grow, is because it also is so hot in that area because of the fact it's like about 2,000 feet below sea level or something like that, that the water just evaporates. It's hot. But notice,
Water would heal it.
yeah, the last part of verse 8 says, then it goes south toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea became fresh. And it will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live. And there will be very many fish, for these waters go there. The others become fresh, so everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that fishermen will stand beside it. From En-gedi to En-glaim, there will be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish will be according to their kinds, like the fish of the great sea, very many. So basically Ezekiel is comparing what is now the Dead Sea to fishing in the Mediterranean. That water, now considering the fact that the Dead Sea today is that salty, and simply because now we have a new source of fresh water flowing into it, that it miraculously becomes fresh water and is no longer salty, that doesn't happen by natural means. God clearly is, miraculously cleaning up this sea and allowing fish to swim into it to repopulate and restock what is now the Dead Sea.
Is there a significance to the direction east, that God left the temple to the east and will return from the east? The Garden of Eden was east of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Which way does the earth turn, and where does the sun come up?
The east.
Who's the light of the world?
Jesus.
There's your answer.
Daniel prayed to the east too.
Mm-hmm. All right, verse 11. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt. And by the river on its bank, on one side and on the other, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither. Their fruit will not fail. They will bear every month, because their water flows from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food and their leaves for healing. So what you see here is today, that area of the Israeli desert, which is salt, barren, and in fact we know it's been barren since, the times of Genesis, because during in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, When Lot and his family fled Sodom, what did the place look like then?
Brimstone.
Salt. When Lot's wife turned and looked back, what did she become?
A pillar of salt.
Pillar of salt. And that whole area has been known to history since the time of Genesis to be just barren and salty, hot. And God is saying at this point He's going to basically refresh it to the such as it was during the time again before the flood. It's going to be fresh once again. All right, we're almost done. Look over, you will, to chapter 48. This we're going to catch the high points, but I just want you to see this. Notice in chapter 48, Ezekiel reiterates the dividing up of the promised land once again. Verse 1 says, "Now these are the names of the tribes from the northern extremity beside the way of Hethlon to Lebo-Hamath, as far as Hazarenan, at the border of Damascus toward the north besides Hamath, running from east to west." Now, I'm not going to read every last bit of this. This is almost like those John beget Tim, who beget this. But just notice the names here. Dan, one portion. Beside the border of Dan, from the east side to the west side, Asher, one portion. Now notice you go down each one. Verse 3, besides Asher, Naphtali. Verse 4, Manasseh. Verse 5, Ephraim. Then Reuben.
Where
Beside
have we
the,
heard those before?
what's that?
Where have we heard those before?
Yeah, verse 7, besides Reuben, Judah. Verse 9 says, "The allotment that you shall set apart to the Lord shall be 25,000 cubits in length and 10,000 in width." So in other words, what Ezekiel has done here is once again, the 12 tribes of Israel are being given their allotments of the promised land. And right in the middle of all that, which is what we see in verses 8 and 9, is that God's territory, where the city of Jerusalem is, has actually been set aside, and that belongs to God. That's His spot. And He's got all the other tribes around Him. Beginning in verse 10, He then sets aside, where the priests are going to live. Well, what would be the point of having priests? Of course, we know that each of us under the new covenant, we are priests to God, right? But we're a priest of a different type. This is the Aaronic priesthood being revived. And that they are going to be in the temple ministering to God, and they have their inheritance there in the area of Jerusalem. Look at verse 12. It says, "It shall be an allotment to them for the allotment of the land, a most holy place by the border of the Levites, and alongside the border of the priests, the Levites shall have 25,000 cubits in length and 10,000 in width. The whole length shall be 25,000 and the width 10,000. Moreover, they shall not sell or exchange any of it or alienate this choice portion of the land, for it is holy to the Lord." Why? Because that's where the temple is. That's His portion. Well, then Ezekiel sets aside, this is down to verse 21, "The remainder shall be for the prince on the one side and on the other of the holy allotment and of the property of the city." And he goes about, this allotment for the prince. Well, this in itself tells us that this is not, definitely, this reference to the prince cannot be talking about Jesus, because where is Jesus in all of this?
Everywhere.
Jerusalem.
Well, yeah, He's everywhere, but
Jerusalem.
He's in Jerusalem, in the temple. His throne is in the temple. So if we've got a separate allotment set aside for the prince, that narrows it down that we're either talking about, again, resurrected David or one of his descendants. So apparently, God is going to honor, and I'm guessing, it doesn't ever say David, but I'm guessing that God is going to honor King David and his faith, and for being basically the father of the royal line by providing this to him. Now, I might be wrong on that. It might be, one of his descendants, but I just have a feeling that King David himself is going to have his own little allotment of land that's going to be there and part of that set aside.
That 37.5 by 10,000,
Uh-huh.
that's equal to 12,913 acres.
Big piece of land.
That's big enough we could put our church on.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me to my question is, where are we?
Ruling with Christ. Wherever God puts us.
Okay?
Just keep in mind, this whole message here has nothing to do with the church.
Right?
Wherever Christ is and wherever Christ wants us, that's where we're going to be.
Okay.
This is all a message for Israel as it's repopulating the millennial kingdom. This is for the Jews, and that's, as Bruce mentioned here earlier, this is the fulfillment of God's covenant with Israel to give them their land and for them to live and prosper in it. They are finally going to be able to live peacefully in the promised land, grow, eat, enjoy life, have kids. That's going to be going on for 1,000 years while we are with Christ.
And will be a land of milk and honey again.
And a land of milk and honey again. Absolutely.
So they're going to be living in procreating?
Yeah, having kids.
And they're living the life that they should have lived.
Now you got it.
Okay.
And they will then do what their mission was supposed to have been to begin with, is as people are born during the millennial kingdom, it will be their job to witness to them and to lead them to Christ. Our job will be to glorify Christ, to be in worship with Him, and to rule with Him. Israel's job will be as His witnesses, to fulfill what they should have done to begin with. All right, the last part of this, go to verse 23. As for the rest of the tribes, notice then it mentions, and I'm just going a verse at a time here, Benjamin, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, and then lastly,
Tamar?
That's just, Tamar's not one of the tribes. That just says,
Okay.
from the border shall be from Tamar to the waters. That's just the name of outlining where the border is. Now, you'll notice in this iteration, which tribe is missing in all of this? Which one is not named?
Benjamin?
Nope.
Nope.
Benjamin is there in verse 23. There's
Dan?
actually two tribes not named.
Dan?
Nope.
Ephraim
Dan was the very first one that was named up in verse 2.
Oh, okay.
Ephraim
Okay.
and
What's that?
No, the Levites were there. Levites
Yeah,
are there.
but the Levites are ministering to God in the temple. Notice what it did not say about Levi. It gave them an area within the holy city there, but Levi didn't get part of the inheritance. Because remember from the very beginning, what was Levi's inheritance? God Himself is their inheritance. They are mentioned here, but they're mentioned as living in that holy area that has been set aside. They don't get an inheritance. Then there's one other tribe that's not mentioned. Anybody catch it?
Manasseh?
Nope, Manasseh's mentioned.
Oh, I didn't see it.
Manasseh was in verse 5.
Okay.
Actually, verses 4 and 5.
Well, jumping around.
Joseph.
Joseph, yeah.
I thought someone
Instead of Joseph, it mentioned Ephraim and Manasseh.
I thought that it said a double portion went to Joseph's.
That's why, exactly.
His name,
That's
his
why
name
it's
is there
mentioned
because of that.
Ephraim and Manasseh,
Right.
his two kids. That's Joseph's double portion. Instead of Joseph getting one portion, both of his two kids got a portion. So that fulfilled the requirement to give Joseph two portions. So you don't see Levi because, again, they're ministering in the temple. That's their inheritance. Then you've got the other tribe, and notice it's a total of 12 tribes. If you count them up, you'll see there's 12 tribes mentioned. Because while Joseph is replaced by his older son Manasseh, and then Ephraim would have been the replacement for Dan as far as in the enumeration. But now, and this is the last part, then we're done. if you go down to beginning in verse 30, when it describes the gates of the city, it says, these are the exits of the city. On the north side, 4,500 cubits by measurement. Big gate. Shall be the gates of the city named for the tribes of Israel. 3 gates toward the north. Reuben, Judah, Levi. Notice here in this enumeration, Levi is back in the mix because now it's nothing to do with territory. We're just naming the gates of the city after the 12 tribes. Levi is included in this one. On the east side, 4,500 cubits, 3 gates. Joseph. Here again, because we're just naming gates, and this is not an inheritance. You're naming the actual tribes themselves. So in this case, you don't see Manasseh and Ephraim. You see Joseph mentioned. Joseph, Benjamin, and Dan. On the south side, Simeon, Issachar, Zebulun. Then on the west side, Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. Verse 35, the city shall be 18,000 cubits round about, and the name of the city from that day shall be. Now notice, no longer is this city called Jerusalem. God gives it a new name. Said the name of the city shall be, the Lord is there. Which basically, in Hebrew is Yahweh Shema.
Yeah, mine has that underneath it.
All right. Okay, then, as I said, we're going to look at the Battle of Gog and Magog and how that possibly fits in to the tribulation period and where it might fit. And then we go back the following Wednesday after Thanksgiving, and we'll pick up back again in Revelation, and we'll hit chapters 20, 21, and 22, and we'll probably finish up right at about end of the year. So that from start to finish, this study will have taken us right at about a year. Or I can drag it out for another 6 months. Which
I thought when we started it was going to be a 2-year thing anyway.
Hey, I can make it longer.
Yeah.
All right. Mario, all yours.